Welcome everyone to my Tier 10 Delving Survival Guide for The Lord of the Rings Online. This manual offers general tips on how to conquer tough solo content and some specifics of what to look out for in Delvings and their Before the Shadow missions. To start off, the number one tip I have is to bring a partner and just run them duo because they are much easier and becomes more efficient time investment with two people. And I really do mean that seriously, but the problem is that's obviously not helpful for a solo player, and there are still actually going to be some strategies you'll want to know for duoing the tier 10 Delvings as well. Another tip I do have is to actually run tier 7 instead, which of course is slightly less rewarding than tier 10, the main thing being the currency that you get, the Delving writs, but they become significantly easier and much more time efficient than tier 10 Delvings. That said, even tier 7 can pose some challenges for players, and this guide will apply to really any tier of delving and challenging solo content. So anyway, setting that preamble aside, let's start off for real by setting up for success. And with this first solo tip, I will say to run high tier delvings, you will need to know your class and what utility they have. Every class has some form of utility, but some have more than others. Along with that, it's also going to be very important to know what your different specializations offer for your class. For example, I can actually build my Yellow Line Runekeeper traits to be extra survivable, so I will likely go with that. It's something I wouldn't normally run, but for Delvings it's very helpful. Similarly, with a Burglar, for example, I could build them towards having more crowd control, which, as we will get into in a moment, that's going to be very important in these Delvings. Even with my Warden, I can give myself an edge by focusing on self-heals over damage. So really just knowing what your class can do, what your traits do, and what your options are and what your abilities do will help you set up for success right from the start. Another way to help you set up for success is to prepare for combat. This is going to involve things like using any sort of buffs you have and consumables and things like that. So for consumables, the most important one is a hope token. High tier delvings have tons of dread, and the best way to counter that is with a hope token. For a bonus tip, you can actually stack the regular group-wide hope token buffs, such as, yes, the ones from hope tokens crafted by jewelers, with store-bought hope tokens. I know that sounds paid to win, and yeah, pretty much. But the point of this bonus tip is that it can actually be helpful since dread becomes higher than a single hope token can counteract in these high tier delvings. Outside of hope tokens for consumables, you still have scholar scrolls and food that you can use, but keep in mind if you do die frequently, these can quickly become very, very expensive. So usually I just end up using a hope token, and if I cheat and run Delvings Duo, I'll go ahead and use the full set of consumables because I expect to not die as much when I'm running these duos. And now that we are set up for success, we can delve towards combat tips. And my first tip here is to just pull one mob at a time, or at the very least limit your big group pulls. Some mobs are linked together and aggroing one will aggro the linked group. That's a pretty regular thing to encounter in instances like dungeons and as well as the landscape content in the game. But the exact links here will depend on the mission, but typically two mobs will be linked together. Occasionally you'll have a group of three that will be linked. And obviously more mobs just means more danger in combat, and it gets especially bad with all the malice affixes in high tier delvings and the mobs that sometimes spawn when enemies die, again depending on which malice effects you have going on. But once you have your mobs pulled, you will need to prioritize which one to kill if you did pull more than one. This is something you don't really have to worry about too much in LOTRO's landscape content, and even low tier instances if we're being completely honest, it doesn't matter too much there. But in tougher content, including high tier delvings, you definitely need to pick out the mobs you want to deal with first. So to go into one scenario, commonly on my Warden, I will encounter a melee mob and a ranged mob in one pull. I'll typically root and slow the melee mob and first focus on the ranged mob because I cannot effectively kite the ranged mob and avoid damage, whereas the melee mob can only attack me in melee range. Thus, I end up prioritizing the ranged mob, and I just use my crowd control to actually ignore the melee mob when they can't hit me. So as I mentioned earlier, when the malice affixes cause a ghost to spawn after a mob dies, I would focus on the archer's ghost before the melee mob because that will still limit the amount of enemies I have attacking me. And this whole chain of events is how I prioritize my targets in Delvings. And perhaps you might want to pick up a similar process, but let's go ahead and get into some more specifics. Well, with these specific mobs, that can vary based on the mission, but typically any tactical enemies such as defilers are very high priority, especially their totems that slow you like completely. And then archers are usually going to be next on the list, and finally melee mobs are usually the lowest priority as they are the easiest to deal with. Also consider that when delvings are implemented to other non-missions form of content, that certain mobs such as captains and defenders that can buff and even heal other mobs can actually become higher priority as well. So it's good to know what the enemies do, and even then the exact priorities can depend on your class, your spec, and your particular build. So it is, again, best to become familiar with your enemies and what they do. Just remember the popular saying, keep your warriors close and your archers even closer. Another aspect of target prioritization that can vary from other encounters and even group content is with signatures and elites. Often in group content, it is easiest, especially for lazy people such as me, to just target the highest health enemy and then let AoEs kill the low health mobs nearby. The problem with this strategy in Delvings is this increases the amount of time you are fighting more than one mob and increases the chance you will be defeated. So contrasting that good old lazy strategy that I love so much, I tend to focus on squishy or low health mobs first. Quite a few of the missions for the Delvings have a boss mob with 2 adds next to it in a group. There are often going to be tough encounters like that that require a lot of strategy, starting with prioritizing knocking out one of the lower rank mobs at a time. Also, this way, if you die, you have an easier fight for your next try, but we'll try to keep the dying to a minimum. Now that we have ourselves set up for success by knowing our class and our mechanics and strategizing our target priority as well as our pooling, we can now delve into some more combat specific tips. So the first tip here I have is to remove debuffs. As usual, the exact way you do this will vary by class and even specs, but debuffs are bad, and in high tier delvings they become very bad basically. It is usually best to just remove them right away, either with your class ability or with scholar crafted potions that are appropriate for your level. That's going to be level 140 because delvings are only available for level 140 right now. Another very important thing to do right off the bat is to pay attention to and typically remove their corruptions. Corruptions are going to be the buffs with blue borders that are removed with your corruption removal skill, which of course varies by class what it is, but everyone will have one. These corruptions that you get in high tier delvings often have devastating effects, but what is honestly even more important is checking the actual effect yourself and deciding how high priority it is to remove it. For example, on one of the rotations of delving affixes, the corruption caused an AoE stun puddle to occasionally appear when you hit the mob. Being stunned was almost certain death, so needless to say, that was very high priority to remove. That was what I did at the very start of combat. A counter example, however, is there was this corruption that spread when removed and just reapplied itself. So it effectively became significantly worse if you remove it. So again, I did want to highlight that it's important to pay attention to what the actual effect is. But okay, we have our debuffs dealt with and we have the corruptions dealt with, but we'll still take tons of damage and have strong enemies that are very angry at us here. So from this point in combat, you can try to just out DPS the mobs, but the odds are that they will kill you if you do not use any of your utility abilities, especially if you don't have great stats or pull more than one mob. Again, this can vary. But among our utility abilities that I want to highlight are crowd control abilities. So crowd control includes basically anything that disrupts enemy movement or actions, including things like slows, which slow enemy movement, roots, which prevent enemies from moving in the first place, dazes, which temporarily prevent enemies from doing anything until they are hit, and finally stuns, which completely lock enemies out of actions for a duration. So temporary knockouts allow us to get away from enemies and give us time to recover in combat. Stuns can give the edge necessary to finish off a mob before they can kill us or again heal up and recover. Slows let you kite an enemy while you are trying to survive, and similarly, roots allow you to move away from a mob and recuperate. Just be careful of rooting a ranged mob because they can still attack you from far away. So these crowd control abilities really become key when fighting more than one mob at a time or when dealing with spawns after an enemy is defeated. If you fight two mobs at once, it's a good idea to prioritize one of the mobs and daze the other if your class has one. For example, lore masters could use blinding flash to daze one for 30 seconds and use that time to fight a second mob. Some classes don't have dazes though, so you may choose to root one of the mobs in a group and then focus on the non-rooted mob. You may also slow a melee mob and kite it while dealing with a ranged mob. Hunters can also set down a trap for a melee mob while burning down a ranged mob, saving the melee mob for later. Either way, the takeaway message here is to focus on one mob at a time and use your crowd control on other mobs in a fight to give yourself an advantage. So again, aside from these examples, it's important to know your class, but this does end up leading into kiting. Kiting may take a while to get used to, and how it will work out in your gameplay really depends on your class. Even fighting a single mob, kiting can make the difference between victory and defeat. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, kiting is the name given to the strategy of running from a mob, staying outside of its attack range, that part's important, while still attacking it and dealing damage to it when you get the chance. This often requires strafing to attack while you're running so that you are technically facing the mob but also running away at high speed. Generally, mobs run just as fast as players, but some classes offer movement speed boosts which can allow you to kite even if temporarily, and a few also offer slows which also allow you to kite, slowing the enemy that is. And then of course, range classes can easily do damage while kiting. You're a little bit more out of luck as a melee class such as a champion or guardian. But beyond that, the last crowd control ability to highlight is going to be well-timed stuns that can let you kite enemies. That is a strategy I often use on my Runekeeper. So ultimately what combat in Delvings really boils down to is using all of these strategies all at once. That is of course what makes the Before the Shadows Delvings difficult and challenging solo or duo content, because you have to incorporate all of this into your fights, which are often quite hectic and a little bit scary sometimes. So while this guide is focused on some tips to get you through these delvings, I should at least talk about what you get from doing so. Basically, why should you want to go through this challenge, and is it even worth it in the first place besides the fun factor? Well, from tier 7 plus, you can get teal gear drops. It's roughly a 25% drop rate from the delving chest for a tier 10 delving. And while there's not much data on this yet, tier 7 appears to have a similar drop rate. You also do get a barter currency that depends on the tier you run. Tier 10 gives 50 of these delving writs, for example, and it goes down into brackets for different tiers as shown here. So the delving writ barter currency allows you to barter for the teal gear that also has that chance of dropping from the chest. It also allows you to barter for one-time use tracery recipes, some cosmetics, and even upgrade tokens for the cloak from the skirmish and the necklace from the 6-man instance. For some more numbers, it takes 30 tier 10 delving runs to barter for a teal piece of gear, but I honestly don't recommend this at first. The gear is actually relatively easy to get from the delving chest themselves. While it is a 25% drop rate for just a piece of gear, there is only going to be roughly 1.4% chance at a specific piece of gear, but when you compare to the other barter options, that's actually a higher drop rate than the drop rate for the other barter options. Things like the cloak and necklace upgrade tokens and the legendary item tracery crafting recipes would tend to yield higher long-term value for your character. That said, if you find yourself only wanting the piece of gear, then that basically answers the question that you should just go ahead and buy that piece of gear if that's all you want. Just be sure to weigh the other options first. And we have delved to the end of my tier 10 delving survival guide. I hope it was helpful, and if you enjoyed this video or learned something useful, please consider delving to the like button and subscribe button for more, or becoming a channel member to support the delving, and thanks for delving everyone.